Again, we have a very diverse set of speakers, although I would say with a very strong Latin American focus, again, but not entirely. So Mitchell will be providing some balance. One of our speakers is Mitchell Orenstein, Associate Professor at SICE, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, joined by Nora Ray de Marolanda, who is currently an independent consultant with a long history of working with UN ECLAC and the Inter-American Development Bank and a major publication on social innovation in Latin America. And finally, Fabio Vera Suarez, who is a researcher and coordinator at the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth, as well as being a researcher at the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil. So again, we're going to have about an hour of conversation, followed by questions and answers from the audience, as well as from Twitter. And look forward to this conversation as well.
Well, good morning again, everyone. We are following a very tough act. That first panel I thought was extremely interesting and stimulating, and we're going to try and do just as well at being lively and interesting and bringing you new things to think about. We're going to be talking about how innovation occurs, what makes social policies innovative, and what makes innovation into a social policy. And then the other question of how do you go from an innovative policy to a global innovative policy. So both the beginnings of innovative policies and their diffusion. And some of the policies we're going to be talking about are going to be very familiar to you because they're the superstars. And let's start with that. This is a question for Fabio Veras. And you at the International Policy Center for Inclusive Growth in Brasilia are the coordinator of the Social Protection and Cash Transfers Unit. And I want to ask you about two of the very well-known superstar policies that you work on, one of which is conditional cash transfers, and the other is programs such as the Productive Safety Net program, which I think you probably do need to describe in a little bit of detail. So please describe briefly what these are and where they came from. How did this innovation arise?
Okay, I think that people are a bit more familiar with conditional cash transfers when we talk about the Latin America context. Basically, the first programs started in Mexico in 1997 as a pilot, but at national scale, and in Brazil in 1995 at the municipal and at the federal district. The innovation of the cash transfers was actually to try to put together two objectives. The first one was the alleviation of poverty through the transfers, and the second one was this idea of breaking the intergenerational transmission of poverty with the conditionalities, so trying to link it with the provision of social services in the area of basically food, nutrition, and education and health. That was the idea behind it. But the way it has been implemented and the way it has spread in Latin America actually shows a diversity of designs, different ways of doing it, and different reasons to implement it. The program somehow became very well known, not only because of the evaluations in Mexico, but also because of the way that the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank were actually pushing for this model for the region. But it's important to keep in mind that there are lots of innovation going on, and the innovation not only with the idea behind it, but in the way it is implemented. So the way these programs were adapted and implemented in the different countries are very revealing of the capacity of adaptation. And I think that this has been the strengthening of the program, more than this push from the international financial organizations of the region. The other type of programs that we're doing research on are basically this whole idea of productive safety nets, or a cousin that is implemented in India, which is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. That's basically the whole idea of the right to work. And I think that they come from different approaches. So in the case of the Productive Safety Net program, the largest scale one and the most well-known one is the one that's being implemented in Ethiopia. And actually, it came out through this idea from the government of Ethiopia and also from the donors. The donors here are a key player, including USAID, that the food aid system that has been in place to fight food insecurity and to fight the emergency caused by the droughts in the region were not working. So the people that were helped, they were still chronically insecure. So basically what they decided to do was to put together funds from the donors so that they could replace the distribution of foods with this idea of having public works that would be run for a long part of the year every year, so that you don't need to have a disaster or a drought in order to have the response in place. So instead of trying to protect when the crisis is already going on, you try to prevent. And then the idea was basically to have public works during the lean season, which is the drought period, through 6 weeks, 6 months in the year. And what they tried to do, it was actually quite innovative, was actually to relate this to the environmental risks that the community face. So most of the work that's done is done in communal lands, and it's basically to try to preserve the soil and to have water harvest and all that. Similar features to the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act in the case of India, that also has this dimension, but it comes from a different experience. So public works in India have been going on for a long time. The Maharashtra scheme of employment guarantee schemes was very well known, but only when the Congress party comes to power, then it becomes a national policy, and it comes also, and it's good to relate with the first panel, it comes from a strong movement from civil society of the campaign of right to work. So it comes from a bit different strand.
So the Productive Safety Net program began in Ethiopia.
Yes.
Okay.
And now it's spreading. So Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, they are trying to combine this or adapt this type of model.
Can you describe briefly what it is about these two programs that has allowed them to spread the way they have?
Well, I think that the CCTs, they spread in a different context. So CCT, it comes at the end of the Haiti crisis. Poverty had increased a lot in Latin America, and we have this urgency to do something. Moreover, from a distributional point of view, we know that the welfare system in Latin America is truncated, it's dual. So the formal workers get lots of subsidies from the state through contributory, but we know that fiscal money from the government goes there as subsidies as well, and the poor were not protected. Mm-hmm. So it was the whole idea that we need somehow to scale up the type of protection that we're going to give to the poor, and at the same time to have some developmental goal linked to the investments in health and education. I'm going to try to avoid the word conditionality because it's quite controversial, and the way that conditionalities are implemented in the countries also vary a lot in the programs. With regard to the Productive Safety Net program, well, I think it was pretty much this idea that we're moving from the protective side exposed to do something preventive, ex ante, that could be much more, to use another word that was common in the first panel, much more sustainable, in the sense that we also would build the capacity of the beneficiaries.
Well, you just described the context of both those programs, the need for them. I'm asking you, what is it about the programs themselves that have lent themselves to be spreadable and used in different parts of the world, adapted in the way they are? Is there anything that is particular to those two programs?
Well, they are quite flexible. They are quite attractive. And also the evaluations that have been made have been quite positive, especially in the case of the CCTs. For the Productive Safety Net program, the evaluations, they were not thought in the very beginning, so there are lots of evaluations coming out now, and they are showing good results. Mm-hmm. But the idea was attractive in the sense that we are trying to do something more than just to prevent, so it's not the traditional idea of our ex-post welfare state measure. And also, it allows some flexibility in the way that's going to be implemented in the different countries. For example, in Africa, community-based targeting is quite common, which is not here in the region. In Latin America, we don't talk about community-based targeting. Mm-hmm. But there, it's something that apparently does work, according to the research that has been done so far.
Okay, thank you. Now some questions for Nora. You were a member of the selection committee in a very interesting contest that SIPA was running called the Experiences in Social Innovation Competition. It was a contest whose purpose was to identify and foster great social innovations at the local level in Latin America. So please tell us briefly about the process and mention a couple of the winners, and please go on to talk about what successful projects had in common.
Okay. This is a project that was aimed at trying to identify what was going on at the local levels, small municipalities, poor areas of the countries, in order for them to maintain or try to increase their level of income, that wasn't known. How were they surviving? What was reaching them or what wasn't? And so a bid was made, or a call for 5 years, a process of 5 years. Every year, a call was made by CEPAL to have people enter this contest, tell us what you're doing, and the winners would get cash prizes. We were surprised at the amount of projects that came in. Almost 5,000 projects came in during this 5-year period. And there was a selection committee, and our job was to go through these and try to identify. Every year we would have 5 winners. So it meant going through a lot of projects, trying to see who were doing social innovation, what was going on, what were they adding, and then once they were chosen, apart from giving them the prize, a lot of diffusion throughout the region of this thing is working. Take a look, NGOs, take a look, development committee, take a look, governments. These things are working, so why don't you try to do something similar to this to try to reach? Now this was motivated, the idea that it was necessary to identify these projects, by the fact that you all know that Latin America has a very unequal income distribution, extremely unequal, and lots of poverty. And when you're working at the local levels, this affects millions of people. So why don't we take a look at what they're doing, how they take things in their hands to do projects, to do activities which will make their life better. So that was the purpose of the project. We went in and we analyzed these projects. And I'm going to talk to you about 3 of them. It was very hard to choose which one of the winners, but I thought something that would different types of projects. The first one of them is one in the first round, the first year, in Haiti. And it's called Lait à Gogo, which translates like milk in abundance. Basically, this was a community this is the poorest country in the region, a very poor community in the poorest country of the region, who lived by doing dairy activities on land which was not theirs because they didn't have titles. Poor land, no water, or very small amounts of water, no electricity. Very, very poor communities. And a local NGO in Haiti decided to approach them, and there were several veterinaries in this NGO, and to talk to them collectively as communities, not to individual people, but collectively. What are the sort of things that you could do to make this dairy farming activity more productive? And they spent like a year talking collectively, bringing in all the population, not just the men who were the dairy farmers, but the women in the community, trying to identify what to do. And the NGO bringing in technology that would allow them to drill wells, to get water, to make their land better so that they would have better fodder. And since they didn't have electricity, technologies that would allow them to pasteurize and make the milk long life milk without electricity. About several months after they started discussing, then they formed a cooperative of farmers. And these families discussed what they were doing, and they started putting together this technology, making the process of what they had done for a long time much better, but also keeping some of the things that they did that allowed them to be a community. And the fact of the matter is that from one dairy, it has spread to now 13 dairies in the country. The level of income of those families has increased significantly. And today, for instance, after the earthquake, this was outside of Port-au-Prince, so it wasn't affected by the earthquake. They are now supplying milk to a lot of the people that are in the camps. And it's a project that is now really a sustainable way of life for a lot of communities, and spreading around in Haiti to a point where they think that maybe they'll be able at some point to produce the milk that is required for the countries, instead of spending their scarce dollars in importing milk because they didn't have enough. That's one project. Second project that I'd like to talk to you about is one that's called Family Housing for Students in Bolivia. And this is in a part of Bolivia that where, as happens in many poor countries, the small villages or the rural areas only have schools that will take you up to 3 or 4 years of schooling, and then if you want to go any further, you have to go to the bigger city. Well, in this particular community, it meant 2 hours walk one way and 2 hours coming back, in a very dangerous place, particularly for girls, but in general. the people there, which are all, they speak Quechua, indigenous people, they decided that they had an activity which their ancestors had used, which is called the utiwawa, where they would send children to somebody's house in a place where they could get schooling, but the children had to work. And most of the time for the children was spent in working for these families. They contacted a local NGO that specialized in education opportunities, and they put together a program which was initially all funded by private donations. There was no income from anywhere else, where they would identify families in the city that had the school, and give those families some money so that those families would take care of the children. No work was allowed. Children would go to school, get a better diet. They would talk to the people in the school. At the end result was that boys and girls finished their primary education like this. Once the project had been tested like this, then they decided to try to make it a public policy. And they went to talk to many of the governments of the municipalities in the region, and several of them accepted and started including budget element in their budget monies to sustain that program. Today, 12 years later, the project covers a lot of children in that department where it was created, and many of those municipalities cover 100% of the cost, because it is for them an effective way to get children to finish primary education. And then many of them go on further.
Nora, let me ask you to skip to the question of what successful programs had in common, and maybe at some point we can come back and talk about the
Okay.
Brazil example.
Well, what we did was try to look at all the programs and see what things were common in them, even though they did belong to different sectors and different places. And we found several lessons to learn. The first one, which sounds like motherhood and apple pie, but is actually very important, is developing active participation of the community in the program. Now, everybody who's ever worked on technical assistance says that. But when you actually get to the ground and see what it means, it's very, very difficult. How do you go into a community like the one in Haiti, where women were not allowed to do the dairy, where they weren't ever considered? How do you get people to have a voice, different people to have a voice? How do you make that, how do you manage, not consensus, which ultimately isn't that hard to do, but how do you manage dissensus? You know, and how do you make the lessons learned be appropriated by the community? How does it become their own? If you do not get community participation, it doesn't become their own. It's easy come, easy go. If it worked, fine. If it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. But if it's your project, it's the community project, then it's important to make it work. Then if you fail at something, you try again, and you try again, and you try again until you make it work. So our experience was that developing community participation is extraordinarily good, extremely difficult, and it's the only thing that would allow ownership, and that all the successful projects had that. Another thing that we found that we didn't think of before, but that was very clear. Communities that develop this participation capacity among them, they also realize the importance of strengthening leadership among the community members and organizational skills. And all of the successful projects that we analyzed had that, had a way for young people and for women to learn how to be leaders and to learn how to organize. And if you didn't have that, the project wasn't successful in the long run. A critical element, particularly in the rural projects, was that there had to be a way for whoever helped the NGO or whoever was involved in pushing a little bit, particularly at the beginning, to develop a synergy between the traditional, sometimes ancestral way of doing things and the modern way of doing things. If the people who came in to give support washed away the old ways of doing it and said, no, that doesn't work, let's do it this way, it's recipes for failure. You needed to bring that synergy and to capture what was important of the traditional way of doing it with respect and join it with the modern way of doing it, and then the project could be successful. A very important element, this is actually, I think, very important for those of us who work with gender issues. A very important component in the successful projects was the fact that the projects tried to eliminate gender discrimination and it effectively brought women to work in When you've worked on gender projects, you know that's very important. But the important part here was these were not gender projects. These were community projects. And many of them before had no women participation. And it was hard to get the men to accept it, but to get the women to accept that they could be participants. That was very important.
Nora, I need to move on to
Okay.
Mitchell. Thank you. So, Mitchell Ornstein, your 2008 book, Privatizing Pensions, so we're going from the very local level to very national level, showed that how this idea caught on globally. So could you please talk about where this idea came from? Knowing what we know about it now, it seems remarkable that it caught on in the way it has. But how did that happen? What were the factors in its widespread adoption in different countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. My work has been on, as you mentioned, where social innovations come from and how they get diffused globally. I'd say to preface it that what a lot of people already have been talking about effectively is a globalization of social policy, right? We talk about social innovation, but we can say, here's this project in Egypt. It's exactly the same as that project in India or very similar to this project in Brazil. And what we're really talking about, I think, is a way in which social innovation is globalized. And I think that in that kind of globalization of policies, certain organizations have a very prominent role, in particular the World Bank and the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, where I believe you worked. So they're big organizations that are institutionally, like you could say, the Global Ministry of Social Justice, right, or the Global Ministry of Health, effectively. The question I raise is, where do these places get their ideas? And I think there's been an implicit assumption in the discussions we've had so far that social innovations are good ideas that sort of bubble up and that come from the ground and then get adopted. But these ideas may also be bad ideas. In the case of pension privatization, which has been very controversial, it seems may have been not a very good idea. So where did these ideas come from? That really raises a question. So are these ideas coming, in fact, out of some sort of study that's been done? Usually not. Usually social innovations are things that haven't really been studied, that they're a practice or something that people pick up, or an idea that somebody has, and it may work and it may not work. And I think that it's important to look at these also in a kind of political lens, in terms of these are ideas that come out typically out of ideologies about well-developed ideas that people have already, pre-existing notions that they may have about policy in general, and they're trying to put those forward and within their own frame try and create something that works. In specific, where pension privatization comes from, I think it really came actually from a very small number, and here's the agency part of it, a very small number of policy entrepreneurs. I assume that this is what SIPA tries to train, and I know my school tries to train, is these policy entrepreneurs who are going to be the thinkers behind these organizations. It was interesting to listen to the women from USAID sort of talking about USAID. A lot of these big organizations, in fact, don't have much content built into them. Right? They have convening power, she said, yeah, but they don't have a lot of ideas. In fact, you could kind of pick on USAID and say, that it's a big body and not much thinking, right, that's going on. So where do they get their ideas from? They get them from a small number of policy entrepreneurs. In the case of pension privatization, Larry Summers, who had been chief economist of the World Bank, got a big idea. He said, we need to, we have global aging problem. We need to find a way, Social Security programs, because they rely on young people to pay for old people. With global aging, that becomes more difficult. So we need to find a way to deal with that. And he pulled out of a set of ideas of neoliberal economics, a kind of neat solution to that, of privatizing pension systems. And because he had an important position in a large organization, was able to commission a major report that was done by Estelle James, who I spent some time interviewing, working with, and developed a whole program that then, and a core group of people, a sort of core set of revolutionaries within this organization to go out and spread the gospel about pension privatization to many countries worldwide, and we're quite successful in doing that. So I think there's a number of different elements here. It's a pre-existing ideology that can give you ideas. It's a policy entrepreneur who's willing to take risks, who's willing to give shape to the agenda of an organization. And it's networks of people who themselves may not have a lot of ideas. They have plenty of problems, not very many ideas of how to solve them. I know you have a column on this, and people are desperate for ideas.
Could you talk a little bit about the distinction between the idea and the enforcement power behind it? Larry Summers is a guy with a lot of ideas, but he's also a guy who wields a very big stick. And I think there's a lot of policy innovation. I'm thinking of sort of the Washington consensus, in quotes,
Sure.
innovation, that the idea in itself may not have been as important as the sheer power of the people behind it to punish countries if they didn't follow these innovations. So what role did that play?
I'm more skeptical on the punishment side of things. I mean, I really believe that the World Bank didn't have enough money or enough power to force countries to do pension privatization. The reason I say that is because pension privatization is an extremely costly program. Because what you have to do is you have to take money that's going to pay current pensioners, and you're taking a portion of that money and putting it away in savings for individual accounts while you still have to pay the current pensioners. So in effect, governments have to borrow the entire cost of the money that's going into these individual accounts in the first couple years of the program, which is an amount that exceeds the several percentage points of GDP. And so the bank simply never had that kind of money. It really was an idea that they were effectively spraying. I really see the bank, and I think IDB, as mainly impactful not through conditionality, but largely through its expert authority. The fact that it has these experts. Incidentally, the chief economist of the World Bank is not necessarily a very powerful figure in terms of being able to wield a stick, as I think Joe Stiglitz experienced, right? But is very powerful in terms of having a bully pulpit of being, you're the lead economist for a major organization that has a lot of respect worldwide, and as was said by USAID, you have the ear of government, you have the ear of all the governments around the world.
One of the interesting things about this idea was that a country that was an early adapter, or perhaps the innovator, was Chile. And Chile seems to me to have an outsized influence on world policy throughout many different flavors of government. Are there certain countries that have that are sort of that have a larger intellectual weight in terms of policy innovation than others, and why would that be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question, and one I've certainly puzzled over a bit. You're right that Chile is a social policy innovator. Some places are just known for certain things, like SIPA is known for something, or SICE is known for something. I mean, countries are also known for things. They have reputations, and they have realities that make those reputations. And Chile has been very important social policy innovator. In the neoliberal policy phase that we've been through since 1980, Chile, of course, was very important because it had a dictator who imported a group of ideological entrepreneurs from University of Chicago and Harvard and other places to develop a set of liberal policies that then later were adopted by the World Bank and other organizations and powerful governments in the international system and supported. So for developing countries, I think a lot of cases they can make a name for themselves as kind of pilot project places or innovators. And in a way, it's easier for a Chile, I believe, or a Poland to be an innovator and be cutting edge. I think one of the reasons is because in contrast to the US or developed countries where you have very powerful local interest groups protecting certain programs, in middle-income developing countries, you tend to have, it's sort of a sweet spot where you have less interest groups who can prevent things from happening, but enough state capacity and enough intellectual capacity that they can actually implement a project. Whereas in very poor countries, you may not be able to get anything done.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to a question for Fabio that I think Nora also, I'd like to hear you talk about this, which is the simplicity of conditional cash transfers. It's a program that, because it's direct payments, and it usually substitutes for a much more complex system of subsidies for the poor. For example, in Mexico, it was a program that was implemented when they took off subsidies on tortilla, I think it was, not even tortillas, but bread, milk, and other things, which was very corrupt and very hard to manage well. CCTs are fairly easy to manage well. I mean, you don't have to be an extraordinarily competent and clean government to be able to run a good conditional cash transfer program. First of all, do you agree with that? And second of all, is that part of what makes it adaptable in different places? And I also want to ask Nora about how this works on a local level. Is a program that is relatively sort of elegant and easier to implement, is that going to have an easier time of scaling up?
So on simplicity of CCTs, yes and no. It can be simple. The idea is simple. It can be hard to implement. So the countries that started that have managed to go to scale are middle-income countries, high middle-income countries in Latin America. So it's Mexico, Brazil, Colombia. Now Ecuador, actually, Ecuador is the one that has the largest coverage. 25% of the population, 40% of the population in Ecuador is receiving it. 25 in Brazil, almost 25 in Colombia, 25 in Mexico. So they are really large-scale programs. There are many challenges. So targeting is a challenge. It's less of a challenge when we start with geographical targeting, which was the case of Mexico. In the case of Brazil, we have quotas per municipality. That's also a indirect type of geographical targeting. There is the whole discussion around transparency of the targeting mechanism. Most of the countries use some type of proxy means to do it. In the case of Brazil, it's the only exception in the region that self-reported income. So there was this big question mark, especially for the World Bank, saying, you are crazy, you are going to believe what people say that the incomes are. But then the evaluations came and they showed that it was, Bolsa Familia was as well targeted as Progressa Oportunidades and even Chile Solidario in Chile. The other challenge is how to get the money to the people. That's also not that easy everywhere. So in the case of Brazil, with the capillarity of the banks, with the correspondent banks, it was much easier. For most of the country, of course, there are some areas that's harder to get. But in other places, actually, you have to have the mobile banks going there to pay. The mobile phone innovation has not got to the region yet. But it's very popular with cash transfers in Africa, for example, in Kenya is one case. And the other thing is the whole issue of monitoring the compliance with the conditionality. And then you have different models. You have more strict models. You have harder models or soft models, as Brazil was supposed to be, but actually Ecuador, for example, they don't have the monitor of conditionalities. In Paraguay, they don't have the monitor of conditionalities. It's much more the message that goes to the families and ways to get this message to the families. So it can be simple in the design, but it can be very complex in the way it's implemented. And the complexity is actually correlated with the capacity of the bureaucracy at both at the central and at the local level to implement it.
At the local level, I guess I would agree with Fabio that many programs are simple in what they're trying to get, complex in trying to implement them. But I think at the local level, what's really important for the program to catch and for it to be replicated elsewhere is that it actually has to solve the problems it sought out to solve. So communities get together, they participate, they identify 3 or 4 things they need to solve. And if by working at it, this program solves it, it catches on, not only in that community, but in others. And that was one of the characteristics of all the winners. They actually did what they were supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that was fundamental.
Fabio, I didn't want to imply that doing a successful conditional cash transfer program is easy. But I do think there's an argument that it's easier than doing a successful other kind of program other kind of anti-poverty program. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, in the case of Latin America, it was easier because you added transparency in the way that the selection process was taking place. That was a major argument in most of the Latin American countries. In Mexico, was a big argument to say, let's make it transparent. Who is getting the subsidy from the state? Mm-hmm. So who is getting this money? In the case of Brazil, that's also important. You can have the list of beneficiaries in the internet. So you can go into your laptop now, your iPad, and check who is receiving in that municipality and for how long they have been receiving it. So there's lots of transparency. And it's cash. So you don't have all the costs of moving around things. You don't create market inefficiency and this type of argument.
And less opportunity for sticky fingers.
Yeah, in that sense, it's pretty much like that. It would be, and that's also explain some of the political support, not from the beneficiaries, but for the middle class and for other people that sees that the money is actually reaching those who need more. So you can make this argument, yes.
Okay, thank you. Nora, you mentioned something very interesting when we were talking before, which was the question isn't just how social policies lead to innovation, but how innovation leads to social policy. What is it? Describe for us the process that a successful local program has to go through in order to get to be adapted on a wider scale.
Okay, first of all, I have to start by saying I don't think enough of it is done. I mean, I think when you identify projects like this that could be replicated, it's a shame that it doesn't happen more. And the process is very complex because this is done at a local level, generally start with little or lukewarm government participation. And then when it's successful at the local level, the government takes interest in the project because of course it's bringing results. But what the SIPA program was interested in is this enough? Are small individual projects, successful as they may be, enough to make a dent in the situation of poverty in Latin America? Clearly not. So the process is now, how do you take the lessons learned and give them to government, both at the local levels and at national levels, and see what they can take from that to use in their social policies. And that's been a lot more difficult. CEPAL has tried very much by disseminating, by meeting with policymakers, and a lot of the programs here have now become social policies in the states where they were created, and now it's being done, like I told you, with the education one. Now the municipalities are funding a lot of those projects. But still, a lot has to be done. It's not easy to permeate the bureaucracy. And so that's the fight.
Is there one particular program you could talk about that has been successful at doing that, and tell us why it's been successful?
Yes, well, the one I mentioned, the one on providing housing for children, that's been successful because clearly the government is spending a lot of money on creating opportunities, places for children to study, and a lot of the children weren't getting there. And so this is a way that guarantees that if you put in an additional amount of resources, which isn't something significantly large, you can make the children finish primary or secondary or whatever. And so the municipalities in the regions where they started actually put those resources in their budgets, and that's being done. There were, I don't know, maybe 10, 15, 20 of the projects that we covered that are now social policy. And I think it's a combination of, it's efficient, it shows governments that the monies that they're spending can actually lead to solving concrete problems to people. But there also has to be people within the bureaucracies that are willing to take to risk their necks. And that's a complicated process, and it takes time.
So you were saying you almost don't want government to be involved in the beginning, but you need government to be involved in the scale-up.
I wouldn't say we don't want. It just doesn't happen. But if you wanted to go up, scale it, you actually, particularly, I have to make a distinction here. There are two types of programs. The income-generating projects, where you don't need government to intervene in the projects themselves. What you need government is to take away some regulations that don't allow people to grow. So you don't need, but in the projects that have to do with health and education and other, you do need government because they depend on the government decisions. If you want to scale them up and not just have a group of very wonderful projects that actually work and that reach 1% of the population, you need government.
Mitchell, let me ask you why, of all the different sort of neoliberal ideas floating around, why was it that pension privatization got adopted by many countries and other ideas that might have been just as meritorious or more so did not?
It's an interesting question. I think it goes again to this question of policy entrepreneurs, right? A lot of things are sort of happenstance, right? It's when you have I think it's the marriage of policy entrepreneurs with ideas, with assuming positions in these bureaucracies that have enormous power. and finding their networks and diffusing these ideas out through their networks that they've established, usually for other purposes. Right? I've actually been writing a paper comparing the diffusion of pension privatization with the diffusion of the flat tax. I don't know if anybody's heard about the flat tax. It came up in the U.S. Republican, presidential debates, right? And a number of the Republican candidates actually proposed a flat tax, and we don't hear as much about it right now because I think the leading candidate's not supportive of it. But you might be surprised to learn that there's also some 30 countries around the world that have adopted a flat tax. And many of them are the same countries that have adopted pension privatization. It's throughout Central and Eastern Europe. In fact, there are very few Central and East European countries that don't have a flat tax presently. And what's interesting in that case is that there's an issue where it's not a social innovation, I guess you could say, right? I mean, it's a social policy, but for rich people, right? But it essentially reduces the top tax rate from around 38% to around 18% or 19%. And there it's interesting that the World Bank actually didn't support it. The IMF didn't support it. And it diffused anyway. Throughout Central and Eastern Europe, largely through right-wing think tank networks, ideological think tanks that supported in part by the U.S. think tanks, but really also very regional, cooperation. So a lot of these things are about in innovation. I think it's it is a lot about agency. It's a lot about people. It's a lot about particular projects. Why this rather than that? Well, it's because somebody happened to be there and get a position where they were able or get the ear of somebody with a position. Let me say a word also about ideology, because I think we have to embed a lot of this in ideology. Things that take off often are things that match or fit into or clearly connected with the dominant ideology that people had. And the reason is simply, and I think I was thinking about this with your comments earlier, that you have to be able to talk to a lot of people to get these things done, right? There's thousands of people involved in these projects. And so for them to understand why they need to do this, you can't start usually just talking about cows, right? Or you have to implant this within a sort of ideational framework that they already have in their heads. And at SICE, we're very, very conscious of the fact that we train people with a certain, basically ideological framework. And that allows them to select certain types of projects that they think are valuable and others that aren't. And it's those ideological frameworks that I think are actually changing at this time, and that's part of the reason we're talking about these issues right now. But I think for me, things like conditional cash transfers really took off, in part because they work, yes, but a lot of times you don't know if these things are working. Pension privatization is a good example, or the flat tax, and you don't really know if these are working for a very, very long time. I would say even with conditional cash transfers, probably in the first 10 years of doing this, nobody really knew if it was working. In some places. And now there's a consensus that it is. But I think it takes off in part because it has a connection with this neoliberal set of policy ideas, because it's very much individual, it's level, it's very much incentives-based. It's kind of an economic incentive to get people to do the social policies. So it's a kind of, it fits in a sort of niche within this broader kind of ideology that's very popular in the world.
You raised a really important question, which was the importance of evidence of success. I think that in Mexico, when Santiago Levy was first trying to get the Mexican government to adopt conditional cash transfers, he set it up as a program stealthily because he knew there would be a lot of objection to it in the cabinet. And he ran it in Campeche state, which is very remote. And he set it up as a random, he took two villages. It wasn't random, I guess, but it was a controlled trial, and could present to them evidence, not that it worked, but that some of the fears that people had about it were not coming to pass. The money wasn't stolen by the husbands and spent at the cantina. It was in fact used to buy children, vegetables and fruit and meat, etc. So he had some experimental evidence in hand to go to the cabinet with that. Is Mitchell correct that for the first several years of conditional cash transfers, there was not a consensus that it could be a successful program? And what effect has it had that the program has had now? It's probably the most studied program on the planet at this point, that there is so much evidence for it.
That's topic is very controversial. what was the role of the evaluation in Mexico. What it's claimed of the role of the evaluation in Mexico is that it enabled the program to survive the transition in government from different parties.
Yeah.
So that was basically the argument. I think that the cabinet was pretty much convinced that they should go for it, especially because it was coming from, it was not only the Ministry of Finance with Santiago, but also the people who used to work in the social area was also very supportive of the program. That had some characteristics of Pronasol that actually started before. So that's, sometimes the argument gets very simplified in the blueprint that the banks try to sell. I think that actually the international impact of the Mexican evaluation was to convince the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank that this type of program will work, that there is not much corruption, the money doesn't leak, and then it sort of became the thing of the day to be financed through loans. So if we get the budget that we have and we give loans on that, that's going to be good for us, because then we're going to have a good evidence. I think that was the self-interest, especially for the Inter-American Development Bank, correct me if I'm wrong. But then we can talk about failure exactly in that phase, because then they started financing with a loan 2 conditional cash transfers in Central America. That was Honduras with PRAF 2. They have PRAF 1 since 1990, but that was not the typical conditional cash transfer. And they had the Rede de Protección Social, RPS, in Nicaragua. Both of them have the evaluations. The PRAF one was a bit weird because IFPRI and the government, they had problems. The government refused to pay the last installments of the evaluation. But the RPS evaluation went fine, and it has the most successful story of CCT. That's our RPS, the Rede de Protección Social in Nicaragua. In terms of health, in terms of education, it's wonderful, results much higher than the ones that we see in Mexico. Then we have elections again, and the program doesn't survive, despite having this beautiful evaluation, these beautiful results. But many people thought that the problem was just the transition, but actually, within the government, the program was already failing. And why was that? The reason was that the program was not embedded in one ministry, it was not embedded in the bureaucracy of the government. It was everything done either by the Inter-American Development Bank, IFPRI, plus some consultants. And local consultants that they have established, but outside the structure of the government. So in that case, unlike the case of Mexico, the government itself was not on board. And if we want to have these programs scaled up, if we want to have countries borrowing money from the international financial organizations to have these programs, you need to have the government on board. Otherwise, we're not going to have continuity. And the evaluation could do nothing about it.
Well, a cynic might say in Nicaragua that the program was too successful. The Ortega government decided it couldn't control it. It could no longer use political patronage, so it killed it. It was a victim of its own success.
Not necessarily.
No?
It was a victim of the failure of the implementation. It's not that the government could not control it. I mean, it's a governmental program, so the government has to have control over it. In terms of the implementation, I'm not assuming that the government is going to implement it badly. That was not the case in many, many other countries. It's not the case in Colombia. It's not the case in Ecuador. There, the program was also started with loans, and they were very successful. But the government had buying this idea since the very beginning. And now they are trying again. Now we have new loans from Honduras, Bono 10,000, I think is the name. And I've heard that a new one is going to start in Nicaragua as well.
Thank you. Last question before we open it up to questions from the audience and to Twitter. Nora, what is the role of evaluation in what you were studying, the programs at the local level, and how they get adopted?
Because all the programs were very participatory, there was continuous evaluation by these are all small programs, local communities. The participatory evaluation continuously throughout the program, and communal meetings to discuss the programs, to identify the priority, to develop the sense of where to go. And so that was something that was just built into the programs from the beginning.
Thank you. Okay, so we will be getting questions from Twitter, and we hopefully will have some questions from folks out here. Is there a microphone we're passing around? Okay, there was one here.
I have a question. I mean, this conversation has been more, around policy, and Rio Plus 10 is coming right now, and I'm wondering, like, if you had one idea, just one idea on policy that you want to come across, if you get the chance to voice it to the right people that is doing the negotiation, what idea will be that?
Interesting. Who wants to go first? Mitchell.
So you're asking for a policy prescription?
Something like if you had
Yeah.
one idea that you wanted to come across.
Well, I'll tell you, you mean in what I said, or you want some new idea? Yeah.
Whatever, if you want to build up it, whatever, something that you said, go for it, but if you have something, I mean, this is your chance to make it.
To say something about it, okay. I think I understand, yeah. I'm sitting here in the researcher chair, you know. No, I mean, I think one of the most important innovations in the pension area is something that you wouldn't have heard of, in part because it doesn't fit in very well with the broader neoliberal approach. And that's the idea of a minimum pension. It's an idea that's being developed by the ILO, International Labor Organization, but has actually had considerable buy-in from people in the World Bank as well. The idea here is that we hear a lot about how everybody has too much pensions, right? That we're spending too much on pensions. In reality, in the world, the reality is actually the reverse, that we're not spending enough on pensions, particularly in poorer countries. So ILO researchers have done a calculation to look at if you were to implement a basic pension, tax-financed basic pension just coming out of general budget revenues, that would give everybody over the age of, let's say, 65, some type of pension that would be approximately 20% of the average wage in a country or something like that. That the cost of that would actually not be really prohibitive. It would cost a few percentage points of GDP, less than military spending usually in many countries. And it would bring millions of people out of poverty. So I guess, you know, I've often wondered, you know, why more people aren't talking about that kind of thing.
Thank you. Fabio or Nora?
Okay, so I would half endorse what he has said. I would go beyond the pension. So there are other types of give money to the poor. That's basically the idea. And one of the messages of the Rio Plus 20, one of the areas is eradication of extreme poverty. So I think that this whole idea of income security and income security for the poor is quite important. Not necessarily just through the social pensions, but through all these other type of programs that are emerging and that try to link it with also other productive activities and things like that.
What I would say is, I agree with you both, and I think if you're at the local level, you have to identify the things that actually increase the level of income and allow these people to produce something or to get better access to basic health and education. And so you have to look at the realities of the local level. National policy is thought of for the national level, for a global level in the country, and doesn't look at the particularities of the local level. And so it doesn't reach them. So you have the statistics that show that education has expanded manyfold, and it's true, it has expanded. But you look at the pockets of people who live in, and it doesn't get there. And the same thing happens to health. So I think, you know, take a look at the local level would be my one thing. Take a look at the local level and try to see how you can get part of those national policies to focus on the local level and to do certain things that are not prohibitive, like you say, in cost, and that are feasible, that get to the local level and that make a difference in the way of living for millions of people.
Thank you. Another question? Yes. In back.
Good morning. My question is for Mr. Soas. I am from the Gambia, West Africa, and I would like to know what impact are the cash transfers making in Kenya, especially in Kenya, and what, how do you measure these? How do you measure the impacts?
Okay, so which country again?
Kenya.
Come from Kenya, okay. So he comes from Kenya.
No, he's from the Gambia, but the question's about Kenya. About CCTs in Kenya. What's the impact and how do you measure it?
We accumulate questions, or I reply?
Can I ask you a couple of questions?
Go ahead.
I was given the microphone, so but the
But in that case, could you hold on 1 second?
Yes,
Let him
of
answer
course.
this question first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in Kenya, there are two cash transfer schemes going on. The first one that started in 2005 is the cash transfer for orphans and vulnerable children. The other one is the hunger safety net programs. They have money from the donors, especially from the FID, but also from the government. And there is this whole idea that the government is going to replace the donors in the medium term or in the long run. In terms of evaluation, there are 3 waves of surveys with the aim of doing evaluation for the cash transfer for orphans and vulnerable children. And some results are coming out. Actually, we at IPC are going to publish next month 5 one-pagers just with results of evaluations of cash transfers in Africa. And at least 2 of them are on Kenya. And basically what they show, and that's good news, one is that it has improved access to education, so school attendance for kids, especially in secondary education. And for those in primary education, the impact was observed only for those who were farther away from the school. So it's actually alleviating the cost of transport. The second paper that I know evaluating Kenya's CC cash transfer program is the one that show improvements in the diet, in the expenditure in terms of the expenditure with food. People moving away from tubers, carbohydrates towards dairy products, towards milk and this stuff. So there are some impacts on food security as well. That's what I can recall now from the papers that I've recently read. So the evaluations that are coming out, they are quite interesting.
Thank you. Mr. Ocampo.
Yeah, I have a sort of couple of questions to Mitchell. The first one is, I was not clear what your evaluation of the privatization of pensions was. Do you think it was a good innovation or a bad innovation? Well, related to that, actually a question. Would that innovation have spread worldwide, as it did in several parts, without the World Bank? Because I think the World Bank was actually the agent that spread otherwise it could have been a Chilean reform for Chile. And the same for many other innovations. I mean, Chile became, for the World Bank, let's say in its most neoliberal period, the agent of a spread of many reforms for Chile, which otherwise would have remained Chilean, have never spread worldwide. And actually, just a comment on that, Fabio perhaps may have commented upon, but there are actually several cases of universal social pensions being working now. I mean, actually, Brazil was the first to do the beneficio da prestación continuada from Brazil, which comes from I understand the 1989 Constitution. But the Bolivians also have a universal pension, which was introduced more than a decade ago. And actually, the last reform of the Chilean pension system done under President Bachelet introduced a universal pension, actually well integrated with the contributory system, so that everyone has a right to a pension now also in Chile. So I think the idea of course, most recently is an idea that the ILO is spreading through, particularly through the Bachelet report on the social protection floor.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for these questions. Yes, on the second one, would the reform have spread without the World Bank? I agree with you that the World Bank was absolutely essential in the spread of this reform. Reforms typically spread in 2 ways. One is that neighboring countries may pick them up because they are nearby and they observe them. And to some extent, the Chilean reform may have spread in other Latin American countries for that type of cause. But absolutely, without a doubt, this reform would never have jumped up from Chile to Poland and Hungary without the World Bank, specifically bringing these people over. They brought people over from Chile to Eastern Europe. They brought Eastern Europeans to visit Chile, Eastern European politicians and journalists to visit Chile. So absolutely, in my book in 2008, this is really the question I focus on, and I try to prove World Bank influence. One of the ways I do that is looking at negative cases, okay? I look at every case I could find internationally where the World Bank pressed reform, pension privatization on countries, and it didn't happen. And I counted how many of those were. There were 3. And there were 35, on the other hand, cases where the World Bank really pressed and advocated for reform, and it did happen. So I think that speaks very strongly to that point. The question about whether pension privatization is good or bad, in essence, let me answer with a one-word answer and then elucidate a little bit. Bad, okay. It's not a good idea. On the other hand, I think this brings up an important point about evaluation, which we've been discussing, which is that people have their own particular ways of evaluating things. Through one lens, a program can look good. Like if you're trying to cut budgets, pension privatization may look like a good thing, right? And I think that's why people like it so much. If you're looking about providing income security to certain groups of the people, it could be obviously a bad thing. And pension privatization essentially gives a big advantage to people with long work histories who are wealthy, as we were discussing before. And it's a huge disadvantage to people who don't earn very much money because they haven't saved very much money, or they have interrupted work history, or they're not in a taxable sector or whatever. So from that perspective, it's been a terrible disaster. I think it's also proved to be a disastrous. Incidentally, pension privatization trend effectively stopped in 2005. And it stopped in 2005 in part because the World Bank stopped advocating it, and in part, I think, because of things that happened in the US and Chile, 2 of the important innovating countries, where the US had a big debate, as I think everybody's aware, about pension privatization in the US in 2005 when it was proposed, and was roundly defeated. And the American people basically said no to this program, to the point where Republicans decided to pull out of it because they felt they were going to lose elections from supporting it. And I think that had a big international impact in terms of its acceptability. So we've seen 5 years without any countries doing any pension privatization. And now we're starting to see, just in 2011, it coming back a little bit. I think Malawi and Czech Republic did some type of more limited pension privatization. So we'll see where things go from that. But yeah, I think it's one of these programs that went for many years and expanded without much evaluation. And from a certain perspective, it looked like a good thing. But I think that the overall accounting is going to be that it was not a good idea.
I'd like to add one more thing. I agree with everything you've said. When the program was being pushed as a very good idea, it was usually presented as something which is very good for the social sectors. But there was something that was not pushed as much, but was in the back of the minds of many of the people that were pushing, that it was a good idea for the financial sectors, because it was expanding the capital markets. And that was what was really moving the finance ministers. It wasn't that it was going to help the poor. It was that it was going to expand the financial sectors, which it did, but at the cost of people's incomes, I think.
Clarification. Just in the case of Brazil, actually we don't have a universal social pension in Brazil. We have universal rural pensions in Brazil, plus the BPC, which is this welfare benefit for the elderly living in extreme poverty, which is very, very means-tested. It's a quarter of the minimum wage per capita. So we don't have the kind of policy, for example, that we have in Chile. It's much more comprehensive.
Thank you. We have more questions over here?
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. The first one is for Fabio, and it's regarding, if you can elaborate, please, about this concept of dependency that the conditional cash transfers, some critics might say they generate. And the second question is for both Mitchell and Fabio, regarding the Oportunidades program in Mexico. I suppose as in Brazil, where President Rousseff is from the same party as President Lula da Silva, in Mexico, we're having elections later this year. And a lot of people say that the PRI might come back again to power. So do you think this might affect the continuity of a big program and successful one as opportunities in Mexico because of the shift in power?
So the dependence debate is, I think in Latin America, it's much more attenuated now because of the evaluations that came out, and they did show that we did not have a negative impact. Even in the case of the evaluations that find some negative impacts, it's quite low. From what I'm at, this in terms of participation in the labor force. But what some of the feminists complain about is actually that there has been seen some reduction in terms of hours worked, especially for women, and that is somehow correlated with the conditionalities, or the fact that they opt to stay more time at home. So that's another type of, another branch of criticism towards the program that comes from the feminists. In terms of the continuity of progress opportunities, now that the program reaches 25% of the population, and actually that Programa de Apoio Alimentário, this food support program, has been extended to the villages that do not have access to health and education service, and that has always been a big criticism with regard to Oportunidades and Progresso, that the program did not go into areas that were underserved because they could not verify conditionalities, for example. And this current government has actually released or relaxed this thing by implementing Programa de Apoio Alimentário. That's basically the same nutritional benefits of Progresso Oportunidades. So the only thing that you don't have is actually the school grants. Given this context, I don't think that any government that wins the election would be able to actually try to dismantle the program. Actually, the program has built a network and an infrastructure that would allow any government actually to spread some social innovations that they want to, or that they believe would make a big difference. That, I think that's the difference in Mexico now, is that we have this new social infrastructure that has a huge capillarity in the country.
It's also an example of a program that changed its name. I mean, it started under the PRI as Progresa, and then when the PAN came in, they changed it to Oportunidades. So it survived that first transition by changing its name. Let's take some questions from Twitter. And here's an interesting one. How is social media and greater transparency influencing trends in public policy? It's a big question. Anybody want to tackle that? You don't have to. We can move on.
I don't have Facebook.
Okay. You don't have Facebook.
No,
You wanna-
I
okay.
think they are. I think they are influencing. It's very. The more I'm talking again, thinking of the local levels. The more information that gets to people at the local level, the better they are at making decisions of things that affect them. And I think that's the big change. I mean, I think in the previous panel was very clear what they showed us, how social innovation can cause revolutions. So I think the local level, at least in the Latin American context, which is the one I know well, are people who are greatly forgotten pretty much by everything that happens around them. And I think this innovations and change in media is changing that, and I think it's very important. The use of cell phone and that is very important. I think it helps a lot.
Here's another great question. How can we learn more from failure? And what is the role of government in learning from failure?
One of the things that we identified in the lessons learned from the programs is that even the most successful project has failures. And the first years are a succession of failures. And if you don't have ownership, when there's a failure, it's easy come, easy go. And you just let go and you do something else. If you've worked a lot as a community to try to get this thing running and you've put a lot of effort into it, a failure comes and you just, okay, let's get together and see what we have to change. And I think failure, nobody likes failure. And government agencies and NGOs and development institutions see failure and they run away quickly. I think one has to analyze what that failure is, and I think failure is an important part of building up a successful project.
Can I say something about that as well? I think in a way that if you let me use an analogy. If you're have a new business idea and you're trying to pitch it to a venture capitalist, right? I think venture capitalists probably would say that a high percentage of the things that they, first of all, they're screening out a ton of things, right? But even a high percentage of those things that they decide, that is a great idea, that's going to make me millions, probably 80% of those fail, okay? And I think that's a very important analogy because, in a way, pitching the World Bank or pitching the IDB on a social policy innovation, it probably has a similar failure rate. So I think for SIPA students, the big takeaway I would have from this is that one should approach innovation with a great deal of humility, right? That it's most likely true that the innovations we think are going to work and the things that we devote our time to and our lives to will fail. And I think that's a very humbling kind of thought, but I think it's an extremely important one. I think it's very hard for the way I think learning happens is a very social process of failure. That there's a group of experts and workers in any particular field, and they're always observing events that go on everywhere. So if you think about it, the fact that pension privatization failed to get support in the US had probably a major impact in Tanzania. It probably had a major impact in Ghana, right? Because people are reading Paul Krugman, right, on the Times website. Really, I mean, I think, so the people, the networks of people are engaged in this active learning process continuously of what works, what doesn't work, what do we think, did this work in Chile, did that work in some other place, and looking at the failures and making pretty instantaneous judgments about those things that have a kind of global impact. And that's why we're in a global social policy world, I think.
I was struck by what you and Nora said about the different ways people have of deciding what is a failure and what is a success. I think the point you made about from the financial sector thought one thing very different than the social sector on pension privatization is a very interesting one. What is a mechanism to give more visibility to policy entrepreneurs? And do we want to give more visibility to policy entrepreneurs?
I mean, I think policy entrepreneurs are, frankly, it's a mixed bag, right? Because most policy entrepreneurs believe they're right, and most are wrong, right? Objectively speaking, I think. And so we need the energy, we need the enthusiasm, because that's part of ideas. That's part of, how you learn things, is you have to try them out. Successful policy entrepreneurs, combine a lot of different things together, and they're very, very rare. That's why they're so important, right? So somebody like a Larry Summers is very rare. First, there's a question of how you even get into a position to be an entrepreneur in the first place, a lot of times, which is often about training. It's about your organization. And SIPA is a good launching pad if you want to be an entrepreneur, but you also have to be able to sell. You have to be able to analyze. You should have a certain humility to understand that you can be wrong about things. Understanding the big ideas that are around, and where you're fitting in with them is important. Many, many, many things. I find it hard to train such a person.
I don't think I've ever heard the word humility and the name Larry Summers put together in quite that way. Yes, more questions from, let's go over here for a minute.
Okay. My name is Jemai Harris. I'm a student here at SIPA. And we're discussing policy entrepreneurship. And I think it's interesting, Mitchell, being here from DC, your perspective is coming from an area that I'm very interested in. It's very different from New York. So I'm curious, specifically, if you wouldn't mind naming, for instance, a politician that is current day politician who's known for and has had success in policy entrepreneurship, and why you think that is. Thank you.
Well, you know, the one that really comes to mind for me is Newt Gingrich. I mean, and here I'm not saying, I'm trying to introduce, when we talk about these terms, we often think about, we have a very value-laden discourse here, right? We're talking about people who have good ideas, right? Okay, or ideas that you agree with or something. But, you know, I mean, I don't know, it just seems like this is, politicians, I don't think politicians are often the biggest entrepreneurs. I think the entrepreneurs, usually the ideological entrepreneurs, are typically come out of more of an expert community. And politicians, since they have to, you know, test market everything, and you tend to be very conservative. But, you know, Newt Gingrich is kind of out there with a bunch of ideas, you know, it seems like. And he had that, Contract with America or something, which you could say was a big, you know, kind of innovation. But I don't know, that's a really tough question. I can't think of a whole lot of, you know, politicians. I mean, Bill Clinton seems to be running around entrepreneuring different ideas right now, but that's post-politics.
I have a couple of comments and a question. I mean, my understanding of a policy entrepreneur, are you talking about a politician as an entrepreneur? Because most of social entrepreneurs are people who are trying to create new systems or change policies. So you don't have to be a politician to change a policy if you're advocating for a particular person's right. So this is one thing. But I would like to talk about humility and failure, because I really don't think, especially in the social and the political spectrum as policy change maker, that people fail unless they put high goals. But I mean, I think with humility, and you realize that things take time, you put different goals and you learn lessons. Failure is much more concrete when you talk about financial. When you know that, yes, the venture capitalists wanted to put money in these ventures and these guys didn't make the money. But with ideas and policies and social systems, you kind of learn and improve so that you reach your goal. So I really don't see it as a failure as much as obstacles and challenges until you reach your goal. So I don't know what you think.
Anybody want to address that? No?
Basically, I agree with you, because what I'm saying is, in these small projects, there are obstacles and there's moments when they think they're not reaching. But if they have a vested interest, if they've worked in the project, if they feel that the project is theirs, the winners, the successful ones that we analyze, people will group together again and say, okay, where did we go wrong? What do we have to fix? And they try to fix it. So, but the problem with that is the timing to do that is essentially different in the people who are doing the projects to the policy makers who want instant success. And so there's a disparity there that makes it very hard. If you don't, for many policy makers, if there isn't instant success, write it out and let's try something else. And our experience in all these projects is that there is never instant success. It's a process of learning, and that's why you have to have the community involved.
Let me say about that. I think that most people don't go through that process. Most people who are policy entrepreneurs are picking up out of the basket, you know, off-the-shelf solutions that have been developed, you know, kind of as part of somebody's ideology of what should work. And they're not going through the extensive test marketing and failure and learning process that you're describing. And that's the problem that I was speaking of, that I think that almost all innovations that get spread, or a lot of innovations that get spread because there's a sort of trend or an enthusiasm, or it's possible to sell it to somebody for some reason. And in a way, the same marketing skills and the same pitching skills that we teach make it possible for you to, you know, to sell an off-the-shelf, not very well tested, something that you just kind of think is right, without going through that kind of process. And that's what I see happening mostly.
Thank you. We're going to close and break for lunch in about 1 minute, but let's just do one very quick round. Give me, please, in 1, 2, or 3 sentences, one idea, the most important thing that you want people to take home with them today.
I think the importance of adaptation. So talking about these experiences and the global social policy, it's quite important actually to be careful when you adapt and see if it's pertinent to the reality where the policy is going to be implemented.
What I'd like to say is, when you look at a situation of a region like Latin America with so much poverty and inequality, there's a lot of things going on at the local level that people are doing because they take it into their hands. They need some support, but not stifling support. So if we can try to learn from what they're doing, I think we would make the world a better place.
I guess my main takeaway really is about how SIPA students and others that I deal with at SAIS, should approach these issues of development. I mean, I think one's basic approach has to be, first of all, that we don't really know very much about development, because if we knew a lot about development, there would be more of it. That's my personal feeling. If we knew how to do it, generations of SIPA students before you would have figured out how to make that happen. So therefore, we should really approach all development issues and innovations as well with a great deal of humility about our own lack of understanding, the power structures that determine which choices are made, and the possibilities that are pre-existingly built into the system. And frankly, I think we're at a moment in time right now where there's a major rethink of the major paradigms that we in generations past have used for development. And that to me is the most important work as an entrepreneur, as an ideological leader, an ideational leader, a thought leader, is to help that process that's being born now of developing a new paradigm for development that will, I'm sure, have some flaws as well, but will build on some of the failures of the past.
Thank you very much to all our panelists.